And welcome to MASHmouth, the podcast covering every single episode of the hit 1970s sitcom MASH. I'm Vanessa.
And I'm Ethan.
Ethan, okay, so I know we don't have an opening topic for this episode either, which has been a running theme for us, but I think that this episode for us is just going to be like a rant review, because we both really were not super hot on this episode. In fact, we weren't even lukewarm on this episode. We were pretty like frozen over on this episode.
No,
so
I did not enjoy this episode.
No, we've been talking about it for a while, even before we started recording, that we really didn't care for this episode. So let's jump right into it.
Okay.
In this episode, Henry in Love, Henry has this midlife crisis and believes he's in love with a 20-year-old he met in Tokyo, which is just kind of, throughout the whole episode, it's just super yuck.
Yeah.
So, Ethan, before we get into the plot, like, give me your thoughts on this episode.
I did not like this episode at all. I think it kind of ruined Henry a little bit, like, at least within this episode. I don't know if it ruins him overall, you know? I still love Henry. He is one of my favorite characters in this show. But this episode just does not make him out to be a good person. This is some real, like, boomer energy of, like, I hate my wife. I'm going through a midlife crisis. I want a younger woman. It's just kind of gross. And just everything with him, with the girl in this episode, when she, like, shows up, is just, like, nasty. I don't like it. It, like, this show, like, normalizes cheating to a big degree. Like, every married character on this show is cheating on their wives to a degree. But, like, normally it's kind of, like, separated or, like, shown to be, like, just kind of a fling kind of thing. But in this episode, he's like, I'm in love. And it was just gross. I didn't like it.
Yeah, I have to agree with you. I also have to do a disclaimer. Ethan does not mean every boomer is cheating and hating their wives.
No,
but
I'm saying like boomer humor of like my wife, grr.
Yeah, it's not great. It does not paint married life in a very good way, and it doesn't paint Henry in a very good way either in this episode. And it was just kind of sad to me. I think we had discussed this off mic, but this whole episode just felt very sad. Just like, your wife and children at home just aren't enough for you. Like, it's upsetting. And the age difference is a whole other thing. Like, that almost didn't bother me as much as the cheating thing. Like, I'm very much a believer that age differences in relationships, like, can work, and probably can work more of the time than we even think in just, like, our normal lexicon. But yeah, just this didn't work as an episode, and I really didn't like the cheating aspect.
The fact that he's married is what, like, really bothered me about all of this. The fact that he is like, I'm in love, she's so great, forget my wife. My wife is trash, my children are trash. I just want this 20-year-old, like, ditzy cheerleader. I'm like, this isn't what I want from Henry. Henry is such, like, a kind-hearted, dorky dad that having him kind of go through this, like, semi-realistic midlife crisis event of, like, well, I'm getting older and I want someone much younger than me, but also I'm married. Like, I know that people go through that, but it's like, I don't need to see that. That doesn't need to be an episode of a sitcom. That is, like, you know, American Beauty, where, like, that movie is, like, a critique on, like, all this kind of stuff. But this episode is just kind of straightforward of, like, isn't it kind of funny that this is happening?
Yeah, I mean, I can appreciate that Henry is, like, a flawed character. I mean, they all are, right? But, this just didn't work for me. And it just, like, I think that the normalization of cheating was just not, just, like, didn't land for me. Like, the whole thing just didn't land. But do you want to get into kind of just, like, what happens in this episode a little bit more, rather than just ragging on it for 10 minutes?
Instead of me ranting about how this show normalizes cheating in a weird way, let's actually get into
when you compare it to American Beauty, I was like, oh my god.
Well, no, like, for real, the, like, subplot in that movie is, like, he's so frustrated
I know,
with
I've
his
seen
life.
it.
Okay, so this episode opens with Frank actually being in charge of the camp, and it's kind of post Henry's, like, trip to Tokyo, where he's supposed to be coming back. And, you know, it's like the ceremony of like mourning Frank's power loss, I guess. And I like this opening a lot. This kind of set me up for like, oh, this episode will be fine. And then it wasn't fine.
No, yeah. I thought that it was funny. Anytime that Frank is in charge of anything is annoying, but also typically very funny, because he was like genuinely comparing himself to these like terrible leaders like Napoleon and Attila the Hun and stuff like that. And he was being very genuine about, it's really hard for us. Like, what are you doing? He gave me Hitler vibes.
He compared himself to like 7 dictators.
Yes.
And he was like, as you know, sitting behind a desk is very lonely. Everyone who's done this before is a very lonely man who deserves your pity. Like, what are you talking about? But I loved how they were having like a mourning ceremony, like lowering the flag and like being like, how sad is this? And he's like, I really fought for you. And it's been like, what, a week? And he's like, the suggestion box, you didn't have to be so mean. You could have left my mom out of this. This was front-loaded with, like, the best bits in it. I was like, I kind of want an episode of just Frank running around being power mad again. Like, I would take that over this episode.
Yeah, honestly, like, this was probably the best part of the episode. Like, just, I don't know, jokes plot-wise and stuff like that. And then right after that, we get Henry returning, of course.
No, this was weird. This is the first, like, tip-off to me. This episode's kind of weird. Because right after this scene, it goes to Frank and Margaret in Margaret's tent, and Radar comes in and, like, gives Frank a message that it's going to be 2 more days without Henry. And then, like, the next scene is just Henry returning. So I'm like, why did we need the information that it's going to be 2 more days? That filled in nothing. Were you short, like, 30 seconds?
Well, I think plot-wise, it was supposed to be, like, Henry had met this girl, Nancy, in Tokyo and didn't want to leave her. So he was extending his, like, R&R, I guess, whatever he was doing in Tokyo, to like be with her. It was kind of like planting the seeds that, oh, something's going on with Henry in Tokyo. It didn't land. Like, I don't disagree with you there, but I think that just like plot wise, that's what they were doing. I do have to mention one thing when they are in Margaret's tent and that's like weird. She's like reading him his diary, or she's reading her diary to him, or he's reading her diary or something weird like that. She made him hot chocolate and she poured it out of like a pan into a cup. And I'm like, how did she do that without spilling it? That's the only thing I took away from that scene, except like the cringy diary part. But
I didn't even notice that. That's really funny.
So after that whole thing with Margaret and Frank and whatever, Henry does come back to the camp and he tells Hawkeye and Trapper that he's in love with this girl that he met there, which apparently he extended his vacation to 2 more days to be with her. And he says, he's like, yeah, I'm 44 and she's going to be 21. So this girl is 20. And it's just like, all right, okay, dude. She could be your daughter. Like, he is old enough to be her dad. It's a little bit weird.
This was just kind of gross all around. When they introduced him being in love, because he's telling Hawkeye and Trapper that he's in love with this girl, blah, blah, blah. I legitimately was like, oh, did they forget that he's married? I like fully was like, is this a Crabapple Cove situation? Did the writers forget that he's married? But no, Hawkeye and Trapper kind of like point out the pictures of his wife and children to him, and he's just kind of like cagey about it. He's like, and that was where I was like, oh, this is like boomer humor, the episode, but like kind of worse about it, where it's like, my loving wife who's beautiful and my children who love me and like blah blah blah, they're lame, I want something else.
Yeah, it was not great, especially because like even Hawkeye and Trapper were kind of like making, I don't want to say like pedophile jokes, but they were kind of suggesting that like Henry had plucked this girl out of high school, and it was like very weird, very cringe. I did not enjoy it. I think that just in our 21st century minds, like we understand that it's not cool for like older people to be wanting to date high schoolers, you know, just the facts. And so I also thought it was like really upsetting that he's telling Hawkeye and Trapper that he's in love with this 20-year-old girl, which, you know, again, it's just like, okay. with pictures of his wife and children on his desk, staring up at him while he's like, I want to leave my wife for this woman. This is the big LUV. Like, stuff like that. It's just... Oh,
yeah,
my God, yeah.
No, like I've said, this show does kind of, like, normalize cheating to where it's, like, normally can kind of accept it as a character flaw of, like, well, they're 5,000 miles away from home, and it's so separated that you can kind of, like, be like, okay, well, everybody needs an outlet, and they're really stressed.
Yeah, you can
all the
almost,
time.
like, understand it.
Obviously, real world morality, like, don't cheat under, like, any circumstance if you can, like, help it. But because he's like, I love her, it just made him so gross in this episode. I keep harping on it, but it was the thing that, like, made this just not work for me at all. Because I love Henry. Henry's a great character. But this just made him, like, a gross old man. Like, people do have this kind of, like, crisis in their lives. But I didn't like it. I didn't like it as a comedy episode.
Yeah, like you said, I think that it's I don't know. I feel like we're being kind of like mean almost. But yeah, it just it didn't work. It just didn't work for us in like the 21st century, being of like 21st century like kind of morality or views or whatever you want to call it. Maybe it worked better on first air in like the 70s, but also like cheating's never okay. So I don't know. It's just like I don't know.
Like humor was more of this like wife bad even in the 70s, so like you're kind of like this was more normalized. And again, if I wasn't like watching this for a podcast and like having to like think about the episodes, because I've seen this one before and I didn't remember like bothering me. So like normally when you're just watching something, like it can kind of roll off your shoulder, but when you're like, oh, I have to talk about this and like give my thoughts on it, you are going to be more critical.
Yeah,
like,
for
even
sure.
The next, like, following bits of, like, Henry trying to get in shape and, like, look younger was such, like, actual midlife crisis to me that it was, like, uncomfortable to watch. Like, him doing push-ups. And I thought dyeing his hair was pretty funny. That he, like, dyes his hair, like, slightly a different color. Where I'm like, it's barely noticeable to me.
I do have to say, when he was dyeing his hair, I said, why is no one pulling the shower tin apart to expose his real hair color? Like, they did Sally Kellerman dirty. But...
That's so funny.
Like, no one's doing that to Henry, but apparently it's like a big issue that Margaret's not a real blonde or has to dye her hair blonde. Okay, sure, whatever. She does it better than Henry anyway, because at least hers doesn't drip down her head when she sweats. Ugh, this is a hot mess episode for the series, for us to record. We are just all over the place.
I liked Radar, like, looking up at him and, like, trying to figure it out, even though for me it didn't look that different. Like, I don't see Henry's hair enough to, like, know what color it is.
It was funny, but that's the thing, right? Is that I can't reiterate this enough that like age differences in relationships, like that's personally like none of anyone's business except the people in the relationship, of course. And I think that like if Henry wasn't married, like I feel like those are real things that like someone who is potentially like dating an older or like a younger person and is older would care about, like, you know, hair and like how they look and stuff like that and whatever. But again, it's the married aspect that just doesn't work.
If Henry was single and like she's an adult, 20-year-olds are adults. We're not too much older than 20-year-olds, you know? And this kind of thing like has happened and can work. It's really just the fact that they bring down Henry to like make him just be like this kind of weird old man who's like using her to try to feel younger. I'm like, no, didn't enjoy it. Not very funny. But
when we are introduced to Nancy, and she is like very adorable. Like I did think that she was super cute. But you could tell that like everybody has an issue with Henry dating this young girl. And I think we said it up top that people are not so much upset that Henry is like cheating on his wife, but that he is dating this younger person. And I think that the sticking point for this episode, you could tell throughout the episode that Radar was really uncomfortable and didn't like this. And I think that it's because Henry was like, yeah, I'm potentially going to leave my wife for this woman, or this, like, you know, this young girl. And yeah, I think that maybe was more why people were uncomfortable with it, like in the camp, rather than like just her age or just that he was cheating on his wife, but that he was like willing to throw his entire marriage away for her.
No, definitely. Radar's a hero in this episode. He's the one who kind of slowly but surely puts Henry on the right path again. And I like that because he also is in universe supposed to be around her age. So I imagine like having Henry date someone who's like a colleague of his, like, could be, you know, I imagine that was like the real alarm bell of like, okay, I need to do something about this. This is not what Henry actually wants, you know, it's just him kind of dealing with his own frustration.
I think that also Radar, like, again, you can tell throughout the episode how he gives Henry the letters from his wife and stuff like that, and keeps mentioning Henry's wife, and like doesn't leave the tent when Nancy and Henry are together, because Radar sees Henry as a father figure, and he's like almost his hero, you know, like somebody he really looks up to. And it's really uncomfortable when someone who you put that much respect on does human things, as like makes mistakes and is flawed and stuff like that. So I do like that Radar was like, yeah, I can see, like, he didn't like it, but also he knew that this wasn't really Henry. Yeah. And he knew what was going to like bring Henry back down to kind of reality. I thought that was just, it was well handled with Radar.
No, definitely. Radar's great in this episode. Like I said, he's the one who kind of guides Henry back, and I like that a lot. Radar can be kind of more of a joke character, more of like just a comic relief guy, but I like that he's kind of engaged in the background of this and trying to do the right thing. I really liked Radar in this one. This was like the shining light, you know, of this otherwise like uncomfortable episode.
I guess we can explain it now, because Radar basically like puts Henry on the phone with his wife when he realizes that Henry is not going to kind of like snap out of it on his own. So this scene with Henry on the phone with his wife is actually kind of really sweet, because he's talking to his wife, and I like the running gag that her checkbook is always out of balance and he always has to do it for her, and then he's on the phone with his son and stuff like that. So it kind of brings him back down to this reality that, yeah, no, I love my family, and this is not something that I'm going to throw away for someone who I'm kind of incompatible with, which I guess we'll get to in...
I love this scene. Like, this scene is, with Henry on the phone, is the one big, like, redeeming aspect of this episode. I love the way it was, like, handled and written, that all that happens with this phone call scene is that Henry is annoyed at his wife and the checkbook, and is, like, he's constantly bothered. It wasn't like he's reminded of how good his wife is to him. Like, being annoyed, like, kind of brought him back down to earth of like, okay, I am frustrated by this relationship I'm in and the fact that I'm not there, but also like, this is my wife and my family. And I like the way it was done. It was pretty subtle, I think, from like how this thing could be handled. I liked him talking to his son about being the man of the house. And that made me, like, sad based on, like, future events of the series. I'm like, oh, no. So this scene was the big redeemer for me.
Yeah, for sure. And he even says to Hawkeye and Trapper, like, oh, remember when I said, like, he makes a reference in the beginning of the episode, and it's kind of called back on that he, like, found the one. And basically he said the one is his wife. And I did think that was redeemable. That was kind of the end of the episode. And
yeah, we're kind of jumping around a bit.
Yeah, we're kind of jumping around. because there's just so much cringe in this episode. But I think that also, like we were saying, like everybody in the camp was kind of uncomfortable with this whole situation. And when Henry is kind of introducing Nancy to the rest of the camp, like in the officers club, Frank and Margaret don't really care for her because of, I think, her age. Like, her age is, like, the sticking point for them.
Frank even tries to say, like, oh, how dare a married man be with a woman?
Yeah, and Margaret's like, oh, he's making a jackass out of himself. I'm like, so are you guys. So, I mean, who are you guys to really judge anything? But okay.
But also, like, at least they're more of, like, equals in their relationship.
It's
I don't
true.
know.
It's true. And, like, that brings me to the point that I was going to make kind of about her age as well, like, why it was kind of weird. Because I think that Hawkeye, like, encourages her to do this, like, cheerleading routine, which I thought was very funny because she does mention, like, oh, I was a cheerleader for Ohio State, which, shout out to Ohio State.
What up?
But, yeah, he, like, encourages her to do this, her old routine. And I feel like that was to kind of show Henry, like, yeah, you might have this age difference and you might really like each other, but, you know, you're not in the same worlds. Like, she is more in, like, the teenage mindset almost still, being, like, 20. And you're a doctor with a family back home in the States. So, like, what are you thinking? You know what I mean? Of, like, she is young. She's going to have, like, this, like, young aspect to her that you don't have. So I think that that was kind of, like, the reason that the age thing didn't work well, because it was just not meshing. The two were not meshing.
It's not like she was an old soul who was 20. She was, like, talking about how, you know, she was reminiscing about her high school days and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, this is only 2 years ago for you. And it's like 30 years ago for Henry. That's kind of weird.
Yeah, it's, yeah.
Even when she was, like, doing this routine, it was so, like, weird, because all, like, the guys were, like, checking her out. And I was like, this is, like, relatively fine, I guess, but it's still, like, I don't know how I feel about this.
Yeah, and, like, honestly, Hawkeye and Trapper were kind of being creepy, too. Like, they were giving Henry a bunch of shit for her being, like, young. Like I said, they were like, oh, look at this, like, teenager. Like, did the gym teacher, you know, call her away because you were being creepy, basically? And then they're just like, wow, she's so hot. And, like, oh, can I have sex with you, essentially? And it's just, well, like, I don't know. It's
Trapper.
Just weird.
Trapper is the one, like, more making the moves.
Yeah,
Hawkeye,
for sure.
Consistently throughout this episode, it was kind of more done with it, and it kind of leads us to our next thing that happened, was that afterwards, by the way, they were in the officers club in this scene with her doing the cheerleading routine, and I like that carries over. I like that we have the officers club now. I like a new set.
Yes.
But after the scene, Hawkeye walks her to where she's staying, and she tries to, like, sleep with him. And Hawkeye just totally rebuffs her, and I like that he didn't accept her advances. For a second, I was like, okay, is he going to? But then he doesn't, and I'm like, thank goodness. Hawkeye maintains to be the good guy of the group. He may be a bit of a player, but he does have boundaries.
Yeah, and I honestly wonder how much of that is, like, because he didn't want to upset Henry, or if he actually had a problem with her age and him being,
maybe, like, a bit of both.
Yeah. I also think that this was kind of reiterating what I felt was the problem with the age difference, too, because, like, yeah, this girl is young. She's gonna want to, like, date around and stuff, and Henry thinks that he found, like, his new wife. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, clearly they were just on completely different, like, paths in life.
I thought it was, like, weird.
Yeah, me too.
The fact that they just kind of make her, promiscuous, I guess, would be the right way to say this on mic. Someone who isn't faithful to even Henry is just kind of like the get out of jail free card of, like, well, it's fine because she actually wasn't a very nice person at all, so, like, Henry can't be with her. I don't know. I don't think this was, like, needed, but again, I like how it made Hawkeye a good, upstanding man. And, you know, maybe it was the age thing. He definitely says, like, one of us loves Henry. and I'm starting to think it isn't you, which I really like that line. So I understand like utility of the episode, but like I don't like that they kind of just reduced this 20-year-old to like a harlot. I don't know what's the word.
I didn't think that utility-wise it was even necessary because, like, I don't know. Hawkeye and Trapper were basically on their way to tell Henry, like, this girl is not who you think she is. Like, she's not going to be faithful to you even if you do leave your wife and end up marrying her and take her stateside and she becomes a stepmom to your kids and all this kind of stuff.
That would be insane.
Like, which would be insane. Henry kind of comes to that conclusion that he doesn't want to be with her, like, on his own.
Yeah.
So this, like, whole thing of her kind of, like, being promiscuous and wanting to, like, you know, date other guys and sleep with other guys and stuff like that, but like by nature of kind of just being young. I don't know. It was like unnecessary.
Yeah.
Because like 100%. I said, Henry comes to the conclusion by himself. So I don't know. It was just weird.
This episode just kind of not great from the start. Like conception wise, it's just like, well, I'm sure for what you're trying to do with the format, like this is relatively fine, but I don't like what you're trying to do. So I don't like this episode. Goodbye.
Yeah, again, like I get it, and like passively watching this episode, it's not as bad as like when we do like a deep dive into it. And I never liked this episode, of course, because I like Henry so much, and like you said, this kind of just like degrades Henry's character almost, even though he is known to be like, you know, kind of like a serial cheater in general throughout the series. But I don't know, this just felt wrong and gross, more so than any other time.
This shoves the fact that he is a serial cheater in your face, where, like I said earlier, the distance of Henry's like actual family and the fact that the things that he does never seem to have like actual commitment to them. Like, that's something that you could separate and, like, compartmentalize. But this episode is about Henry being a cheater. So you have to, like, deal with that for the entire time. And it's just not something that you want from your funny fishing hat dad character of the group.
I do wonder, and I kind of just had this thought, because MASH, of course, like pushed the boundaries of things that were like acceptable at the time on TV. And, you know, we were coming off of like the 50s, and even though this was set in the 50s, this was, you know, in the 70s. We're coming off of this like sitcom-y kind of thing of just like a Leave It to Beaver kind of thing, or a Dad Knows Best type of thing, where it was just like everybody's like really respectable and everything's just like okay. Like in the past, you would not see people like cheating on their spouses and whatnot. So
no, that's true.
Like I do, like I have to, again, I don't like this, of course, but like I kind of have to almost appreciate the fact that they were kind of pushing the boundaries of like, oh, see, like every man wants to cheat on his wife with a younger girl, like that kind of thing, even though of course that's not true, like, you know, whatever, but it was doing that thing where it was almost like shocking, you know?
I didn't think about that, how this kind of fits in with the context of MASH kind of pushing boundaries and being the show that kind of broke the mold of these otherwise like very squeaky clean shows. Granted, like the 50s were 20 years ago at this point, but it's still something that I'm sure lingered on the television standards for a long time, that like everything had to be like moralistically upstanding, everyone had to be like a nice person, and having one of your sweetest characters in your show have the plotline be that he sucks it's gotta be a very interesting kind of daring thing to do for the time.
Even shows like All in the Family that were a little bit more controversial, I would say, probably maybe less controversial than MASH, but All in the Family had like Archie Bunker, who was like pretty much an out and proud racist, but like whatever, right? But like even he, like with his whole like, oh, he can't stand his wife kind of thing, like he was, as far as I know, like never really like unfaithful to her, you know, that kind of thing.
Who would cheat with Archie Bunker though? Let's be real.
That's true, but yeah, I don't know, this episode, like if you think about it, I guess from that light, it like I can respect it a little bit more, even though I didn't really enjoy it.
MASH walked so the anti-hero of today can run, is what we're trying to say. Move over.
Lead me into trivia. We gotta wrap this up.
Yeah, so we already talked about the conclusion of this episode with Henry's phone call and how it kind of leaves us on a bit of a better note. So with having that discussed, do you have any trivia for us in this episode?
I do. So this trivia is actually kind of interesting. As much as we didn't like this episode, I really like when we have fun trivia. So Catherine Bauman played Nancy Sue Parker in this episode, the girl who Henry is cheating with. She was born and raised in Independence, Ohio, which I thought was really interesting because in this episode, I could have sworn that she was trying to cover up like an Australian accent. Did you think the same thing?
She did sound kind of like vaguely British.
I thought
so
she was Australian. No, she was born and raised in Independence, Ohio. So clearly I was off the mark.
Maybe Mary Sue was affecting that accent to sound cooler. Who knows?
I don't know. So she was actually a cheerleader in high school. And this is interesting. In 1969, she won Miss Ohio. And in 1970, she was the first runner-up for Miss America, which I thought was really cool.
That makes sense. She was very pretty.
She was really pretty. And those like cheerleader moves that she did were
pretty legit.
Like really her. Like she was actually doing them. She was, for like the talent portion of Miss America, she did like a gymnastics routine. So I thought that was really cool.
It kind of makes me wonder if they like wrote this character for her. Because she's also from Ohio, this character. So that's interesting.
Yeah, they definitely, I would say like 100% they put these little Ohio things in there for her. Which I thought was very cute. So after MASH, she did several guest spots on TV shows in the 1970s and 80s, including Knight Rider, Fantasy Island, The Dukes of Hazzard, and, drumroll please, Trapper John MD.
Oh my god! Trapper John MD. Has anyone ever watched Trapper John MD? I don't know. But apparently, it has everyone from MASH on it.
Yeah. She also did several guest appearances in movie roles. She mostly did TV personality things like on like the TV Guide channel and E! Network and stuff like that, where she was just like kind of being herself. And she also had a pretty extensive photo modeling career as well. She founded the company Catherine Bauman Beverly Hills, which designs luxury handbags and other accessories. And interestingly enough, in 2001, she sued and won against a group of Manhattan entrepreneurs or Manhattan just people who were ripping off the designs of her handbags. So we love intellectual property.
That's pretty cool. I like that a lot of the people who are on this show, who you just think are like, oh, well, they're a pretty flash in the pan, go on to do like a lot of things. I like that a lot.
Yeah, especially since she was well known probably before this episode as well.
Yeah.
Or like pretty well known.
You don't run for Miss America in the 70s and not be well known.
Catherine Bauman is still alive today, and she is 72 years old. So I thought that was just really cool to have her as a guest on this show.
Nice. You'll love to hear it. You'll love to see it. So, Vanessa, I think we all know what you're going to rate this episode. But I have to ask, what would you rate this episode out of 5 martinis?
I would rate this episode probably like 1.5 martinis. That's like the lowest I think I've ever gone, but maybe I'd give it 2 just because, like I said, with the boundary pushing that it kind of did for American television of just like, oh, see, this character is bad, or like this character is a human being. But I think I'd probably stick with like 1.5.
Wow, you're actually going higher than me. I give this a 1. I did not enjoy this episode at all. I know there's some fun historical context, but guess what? You earned that 1. Otherwise, it'd be like half a martini. Because the one thing that I liked in this episode was the scene with Henry on his phone. That was the one thing. So that bumped it up to 1 star for me. Otherwise, this would be like nothing. I would just like leave this martini on the table and wouldn't even drink it. Didn't like this one.
So, just to wrap up, we'd like to give thanks to Jacob Fierbalco for being our technical consultant, Melissa, my sister, for cover art, and of course, our listeners. Thank you so much. Our music, social media, and contacts for the show are linked in the description as always. And join us next week for Season 2, Episode 17, For Want of a Boot. And until then, be nice to the nice, because it's nice to be nice to the nice. Goodbye, farewell, and amen.
Bye, everyone.